The event hall was lit with golden tones and the tables were impeccably set. A soft band played in the background while waiters circulated with glasses of champagne. It was Camilla's wedding, a luxurious event that brought together important figures from the world of business and high society. But among the guests, one was missing: Julia. She discovered by chance that she was not on the guest list when she saw a post on social media about the party. At first, she thought it was a mistake, but a quick call to her mother was enough to understand the truth. Your sister needs to maintain an image. You don't fit in this world. The words cut through Julia like a cold blade. She had spent her entire life working herself to death to help raise Camilla. She was the one who paid for her sister's studies when no one else could. Now, when it was time to celebrate one of her sister's greatest achievements, she was discarded as if she had never existed. In the same room, at a table discreetly away. From the center of the party, Lucas twirled his glass of whiskey in his hands, unable to pay attention to anything around him. His mind was far from there, immersed in the discovery he had made that morning. His parents had used his name to take out a huge loan and finance his younger brother Felipe's business. Years of saving and hard work to open his little cafe had been destroyed in the blink of an eye. The bank had already notified him. Either he paid the debt, or he would lose everything. He knew he shouldn't be there, surrounded by these fake people, but at the same time he wanted to look his parents in the eye and ask, why? Why had Felipe always been given everything on a silver platter, while he had to fight for every penny? Across the room, Diego held a glass of wine without even realizing he hadn't taken a sip yet. He tried to keep his expression neutral, but inside, his blood was boiling. Camilla's wedding was the first time he had seen his sisters since the reading of their father's will. He could still taste the bitterness of that day. He had grown up hearing that he wasn't strong enough to run the family business, but he never imagined that his own sisters would completely erase him from the inheritance. They had spent the last few years convincing their father that he didn't deserve anything, and they had succeeded. "You were never meant for this world," one of them had said without any remorse. Now here they were, laughing, toasting, living in what they had always considered their own world. Diego wondered, should he fight for what was rightfully his? Or should he simply walk away and start from scratch? Near the garden area, Renata was alone, watching the party through the glass doors. She didn't even know why she had come. Maybe it was the desire to face her mother head-on, to look into the eyes of the woman who had discarded all her years of sacrifice as if they were nothing. While she had given up everything to take care of her sick father, her brother Gustavo lived his life abroad, far from any responsibility. But in the end, he was the one who inherited everything. Her mother said it was the right thing to do. After all, Renata was a woman. She would soon get married and have someone to support her. As if her life could be defined that way, as if her value was conditioned by what others could give her. Her stomach churned with indignation. She had spent too much time trying to prove her worth to people who never really cared. Bruno entered the room with heavy steps, feeling an invisible weight on his shoulders. The wedding was an event full of familiar faces, people from the construction industry, businessmen, investors. He should have felt at ease there after all. He had spent years dedicating himself to his father's company, proving that he was capable, that he was ready to take over the business. But all that fell apart when his father decided to hand the company over to a distant cousin, someone who had never lifted a brick in his life. The justification was as cold as it was predictable. "You're too emotional to run something like that." As if empathy were a flaw, as if Bruno were weak for caring about the people who worked alongside him. Now, standing there, watching his father chatting animatedly with the new heir to the company, Bruno wondered if it was still worth trying to prove something to someone who had never really seen him. Near the dessert table, Carla pretended to be interested in some random conversation, but her mind was elsewhere. She still felt the tightness in her chest since she found out the truth about her grandmother's inheritance. She'd been the only one to take care of her in the last few years, the only one who was there when times were tough. And in the end, none of that mattered. Her siblings, who barely showed up for visits, pressured her grandmother to change her will. When Carla confronted her mother about it, she heard a dismissive, "Family should always help each other." But why did this logic never apply to her? Why was she always the one who had to understand, sacrifice, give up? Anger bubbled inside her. Maybe it was time to stop swallowing everything and start fighting for what was hers. Marco watched everything from afar. his gaze fixed on João, his cousin, who was laughing next to the bride as if nothing had happened. They grew up together, more like brothers than cousins, and Marco always thought that this connection was unbreakable. But then came the wedding invitation, or rather, the lack thereof. For months, João had assured him that he would be the best man, that nothing would make sense without him at the altar. But at the last minute, Marco was replaced by someone more suitable. The excuse came quickly and coldly. The bride wanted someone more refined, someone who would better fit in with the image they wanted to convey. As if Marco were disposable, an accessory that didn't fit into the perfect aesthetic of the ceremony. He felt the betrayal like a punch in the stomach. For the first time, he saw clearly what had always been there. He had never been real family to João, just a convenient piece when needed. At the bar, Isabella swirled the ice in her glass, lost in her own thoughts. Her entire life had been built on a lie. She grew up hating a father who, in reality, never abandoned her. Her mother had always told the same story. He disappeared when Isabella was a baby, without looking back. But a chance. Conversation with an old family friend revealed another version, a truth that crushed her. Her father had fought for her, tried to keep in touch, but her mother had pushed him away, manipulated the narrative until Isabella grew up with a distorted image of him. Now, her father was alive, perhaps waiting to one day be able to talk to her. But what if it was already too late? What if he had given up? The weight of the decision suffocated her. Rafael closed his email for the 10th time that night, but the words kept burning in his mind. His sister, Mariana, had sold their company without even telling him. Years of sacrifice, late nights working together, sharing every victory and every failure, all reduced to a selfish and unilateral decision. "It was the best for me," she said, as if that were an acceptable justification, as if he had no right to choose, as if his dedication was worthless. He looked around the room, seeing Mariana chatting as if nothing had happened. As she moved easily through the crowd, Rafael felt his stomach churn. Perhaps the worst part of the betrayal was not the loss of the business, but the realization that his sister had never seen him as a true partner, just a step on her ladder. Leandro stood on the balcony of the ballroom, looking up at the dark sky. The party continued behind him, but the buzz of the guests seemed distant. He held his cell phone in his hand, staring at the last message his father had sent him weeks before. "When are you coming?" "Your mother said he's always busy, but try to come by on Sunday." He never answered. There was always an appointment, an excuse, something more important. And now, his father was dead. No goodbyes, no last conversation, just emptiness. But what hurt the most wasn't the guilt of his absence. It was what his mother had said on the phone that morning. "He waited for you." That sentence echoed like a hammer inside him. The time he thought he would have was simply over. At the height of the party, when the guests toasted and the bride and groom danced to applause, the invisible tension between those who carried family scars grew. Julia watched from afar, her glass firmly in her hands, trying to swallow the humiliation of not having been invited to her sister's wedding. The weight of exclusion mixed with anger, and all she wanted was to understand how someone could erase years of sacrifice so easily. But then, her gaze met Lucas's, who was sitting at the bar, his expression full of frustration. He also seemed to be burdened with something greater than the party could mask, and he wasn't the only one. Little by little, Julia began to realize that she wasn't the only one they're feeling out of place, discarded by those who should have valued her. In the opposite corner of the room, Diego saw Mariana, Rafael's sister, talking animatedly with Felipe, Lucas's brother. The same Felipe who had his dream financed at the expense of his brother's ruin. The same kind of person Mariana was. Someone who put her own interests above any bond. Diego felt a knot in his stomach as he realized the pattern that was repeating itself there. People who took advantage of others' trust to get what they wanted. People who used the word family only when it was convenient for them. He then looked around and recognized looks similar to his own. Looks of tiredness, of frustration, of people who had spent too much time fighting for a recognition that would never come. Maybe, finally, it was time to stop. Fighting for places where they were never welcome. Bruno dropped his glass of whiskey on the table with a dull thud. The entire party seemed like a theater where only a few people had lines, while the others were dispensable extras. He saw his father cross the room, laughing next to the cousin who had inherited the company. The man who, according to him, had the best profile for the business. His blood boiled. Why did he still care? Why did he still expect recognition from someone who had never really seen him? At that moment, he realized he wasn't the only one feeling that way. His eyes met Carla's, who was holding her wine glass too tightly, her gaze lost, as if she was fighting against the anger of seeing her brothers spend a fortune on a wedding while she had to fight for everything alone. The pattern was clear. Renata noticed it too. Her gaze swept across the room and saw the same feeling reflected in other people. Yulia, isolated, with her shoulders tense. Raphael, watching. His sister as if trying to understand when she became capable of such coldness. Marco staring at João, as if waiting for him to somehow admit his mistake. Leandro standing near the balcony, seeming to carry an invisible weight that was crushing him. Everyone there had been betrayed, discarded, left behind by those who should have been their greatest allies. Renata took a deep breath. For the first time, she understood something essential. They were never the problem. The problem was that they insisted on holding on to bonds that had long since been broken. Lucas stood up from the bar, feeling his pulse racing. He didn't know exactly what he would do, but he couldn't stand to stay there any longer, pretending nothing had happened. He walked through the room, avoiding the people who were celebrating without even realizing the weight that some absences carried. When he passed Raphael, he saw that he also seemed to be on the verge of something. A breakup, a decision, perhaps a point of no return. That was when Julia approached him and said, almost in a whisper, "I don't deserve this." Lucas didn't need to ask what she was talking about. He knew. And when he looked around, he realized that everyone there knew. That night wasn't about them. It never was. It was about the people who had always been seen as a priority, while others were left behind. Near the dance floor, Diego saw his sisters toasting with Felipe and Mariana. It was almost symbolic. The ones who had always been given everything effortlessly celebrating together, while the ones who had always had to struggle stood on the sidelines, watching. But then something changed inside him. He didn't need to watch this anymore. He didn't need to try to be a part of something that clearly didn't want him. Life wasn't about convincing others of your worth. It was about knowing when to stop trying. He set his glass down and started walking toward the exit. He didn't look back. He didn't need to anymore. One by one, the others began to realize the same thing. Renata put down her glass and headed for the door. Marco tossed his napkin on the table and did the same. Leandro took a deep breath and walked to the hall. They didn't need to justify themselves. They just needed to leave. When Julia walked through the door of the salon and felt the cold night air hit her face, it was like a weight was lifted from her shoulders. For years, she believed she had to prove something to her family, that their love came with conditions that, if she followed them to the letter, maybe one day they would truly accept her. But now she saw clearly. It was never about effort. It was never about her being good enough. Some people just choose who is worth keeping around, and she was never on that list. And that was okay. For the first time in her life, Julia felt like she didn't need to insist anymore. She looked to the side and saw Lucas standing there, with the expression of someone who finally understood the same thing. They didn't need to hold on to the past anymore. Raphael took a deep breath, closing his eyes for a moment. He had spent his entire life believing that family was a safe haven, that Mariana was his partner, someone he could count on. But now he understood that some people confuse blood ties with chains. His sister had not hesitated to leave him behind when it was convenient. So why did he still hold on to that? He opened his eyes and saw the others leaving the room, one by one, each, carrying their own story of betrayal, their own disappointment. But that night, something changed. They were no longer victims trying to understand what they had done wrong. They were people who had finally understood that they were in the wrong place. And now, they were moving on. Bruno leaned against one of the pillars outside the hall, watching the movement around him. For years, he had sought recognition from his father, proving that he was capable, that he deserved to continue the family legacy, but it had all been in vain. His father's view of him would never change, because there was never any room for him in that story. When he saw Diego standing a few feet away, staring at the ground as if processing everything that had happened, Bruno realized that he was not alone. There was a cruel pattern there, repeated in different forms, different contexts, but always with the same result. Some were made to win effortlessly, while others were discarded when they were no longer useful. But at that moment, Bruno understood that the game only continued because they agreed to play. Renata took off her shoes, holding them in her hands as she felt the cool grass beneath her feet. She had spent years trying to be recognized, trying to show her mother that she deserved a place in the family too, that her efforts were worth something. In the end, all she got was a, "You're getting married. You don't need this." But now, looking at the people around her, Lucas, Julia, Raphael, Bruno, Diego, she realized that maybe what they needed wasn't recognition from those who had never seen them. They needed to recognize themselves in each other. Maybe family wasn't just about blood. Maybe it was about those who truly understand your pain, who have been there, who know what it means to be discarded and still find the strength to move on. For the first time, she felt like she wasn't alone. Marco ran his hands over his face, letting out a long sigh. All his life, he had believed that João was more than a cousin. He was a brother. They had grown up together, shared moments, dreams, promises. And yet, at the first opportunity, João had made it clear that blood ties meant nothing when it came to convenience. Marco felt a silent anger take hold of him, but for the first time it wasn't an anger that held him back. It was an anger that set him free. He didn't need anyone's validation to know who he was. And looking around, he realized that the others were beginning to understand this. Too, everyone there had been replaced, forgotten, discarded, but together, they seemed more whole than ever. Leandro watched the sky for a moment before closing his eyes and letting out a slow breath. He couldn't go back in time. He couldn't have that last conversation with his father. He couldn't undo all the times he'd put off a visit. But he could choose what he would do from now on. The weight of regret would never go away, but maybe he could transform it into something different. Maybe he could use that pain to become someone better, someone who wouldn't repeat the same mistakes. He looked at the others and saw the same light in their eyes. Not of sadness, but of understanding. They weren't leaving that night defeated. They were leaving free. Carla crossed her arms and looked around the room one last time. Inside, her brothers continued to laugh, toasting as if nothing had happened, as if she had never existed. The injustice burned inside her, but at the same time, something new began to grow. A certainty. No matter how many times she tried, that family would never see her. And that was okay. She no longer needed their recognition to know her worth. Carla turned to the others outside and realized that they all seemed to feel the same way. It was no longer about revenge, about proving something. It was about letting go of the weight of years of fighting for a place that was never theirs. Lucas shoved his hands in his pockets and smirked. The irony of it all was that for so long, he had felt alone in his own pain, the betrayal of his parents, the theft of his future, the humiliation of always being the second option. But now, seeing everyone there, people with different stories but such similar pain, he realized that he had never really been alone. The world would always favor some and forget others. But in that moment, they had something more valuable than any inheritance, than any recognition, the choice to move forward. Without looking back, Raphael took a step back, observing the group around him. For years, he had believed that family was something unbreakable, a bond that, no matter what, would always endure. But that night, he realized that this was not always the case. Sometimes family was just a fragile concept, shaped by interests, preferences, and convenience. And that was okay. He no longer had to carry the weight of trying to belong in a place that was never his. True strength was not in being accepted, but in knowing when to walk away. He looked at the others, and one by one, they understood each other without having to say anything. They were no longer victims. They were survivors. Without looking back, one by one, they began walking in the same direction, leaving the ballroom behind. There were no grand speeches, no spectacular revenge, just the silent but powerful decision to no longer insist on doors that had always been closed. In the end, it wasn't those who stayed at the party who won. It was those who had the courage to leave. And in that moment, each of them knew that they would never be the same again.